So hello everyone, your Professor Natalie Cox here, and I'm oh so happy to welcome and introduce Karen Nelson Villanueva here to talk with us all about Buddhism today. Say hello, Karen.
Hi everyone.
And just wanted to, you have an amazing background. If you could share with our students where that is, I think they'd be very intrigued.
This is a photo, and I was thinking, did I take the photo or did I steal it from the internet? But I was actually here. It's in Borobudur, Indonesia, outside of Yogyakarta, and I'm there at dawn. And this is one of the Buddhist sites around the world, and it has a lot of stupas at the top, and inside every stupa is an image of the Buddha. So here you see, this is the Buddha's head that would be inside one of the stupas. So it's an amazing place. And what you can see off in the distance are the active volcanoes on the island there.
Amazing. That's so beautiful. Thanks for sharing that info. Here we are.
Hi, and welcome to my lecture on Buddhism, Mantra, and Magical Realism. Thank you for inviting me to your class to talk about this topic. My name, again, is Karen Nelson Villanueva, and I have been a practitioner of what we call Tibetan Buddhism, or otherwise known as Vajrayana Buddhism, since 2003. And I also have a doctoral degree in philosophy and religion with a specialization in women's spirituality. So religion, Buddhism, and mantra, which is the focus of my dissertation, is something very dear to me. So thank you. So just at the outset, I want to say that this is a quote from His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, and you've probably heard of the Dalai Lama. And he says that our aim should be to serve, not to convert. And I include this quote because I think it's important to know that by presenting this knowledge and sharing this knowledge with you, I have no intention of trying to convert you to Buddhism. It's just a sense of sharing and knowing something of others' religious practices around the world. So today I'd like to talk about, or I'd like to start with a brief meditation. Then we'll talk about tools for prayer, the Buddha's life, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the spread of Buddhism around the world, mantra, which we'll get into the most prominent mantra in Tibetan Buddhism, which is Om Mani Padme Hum, magical realism, Buddhist symbolism, and Buddhism in art and architecture. So let's begin with a meditation. And I'd like to begin with a meditation on compassion. So wherever you are, if you could stop right now and either sit in a chair or sit cross-legged on the floor. What you need to do is have both feet firmly on the floor, and you can have your hands on your knees or in the mudra of meditation, which is right hand over left with thumbs touching. Now you can either close your eyes or just gaze off unfocused, or you can look at this mandala that I have projected on the screen. And just take a moment and just relax. Notice your breath slowing down. Notice the sounds of the world around you. And just slowly breathe in and out. Now gaze at the end of your nose with your eyes slightly closed. And silently pay attention to your breath. Feel the air enter your nostrils. Fill your lungs. Then escape your lungs through your nostrils again. As you continue to breathe, I'll lead you in the meditation on compassion. Compassion benefits not only others, but ourselves as well. Whereas love is the desire for others to be happy, compassion is the desire to actually bring about their happiness by freeing them from their suffering. And this is accomplished through practicing loving compassion in your life toward others. So I'd like you to envision now all the people who love and support you around you. Your mother is on your left, or that person who is like a mother to you and has supported you in your life. Your father to your right, or again, someone who has loved and supported you in your life like a father. And all your relatives and loved ones are behind you, again, giving you love and support. Wish these beings happiness. May they be safe. May they be well and happy. May they have success in all they do. And now see beings in front of you who you may have had a difficult time with. And part of this practice is recognizing that everyone, all beings, want to be happy. Wish them well. Wish them safety and happiness and peace. And now, without feeling overwhelmed, just imagine all beings of creation around you. No one is too close, no one is jostling you. Everyone is keeping a safe and healthy distance. Wish everyone wellness, safety, happiness, peace, and success in all they do. Now feeling loved and buoyed by everyone's support and sending all this love out to the world. Feel in your heart that you are safe, that you are happy, and that you are at peace. And please open your eyes now and return to this space so that we can begin this workshop on Buddhism. So one important aspect of Buddhism is that there are prayers, and these prayers are followed or called typically mantra, is what we call our prayers in Buddhism. And for mantra, we use a mala. And the mala are the beads that are projected in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen with the yellow tassels. That's a traditional Buddhist mala of 108 beads. Now what you see in the upper right-hand corner is japa. These are the beads typically used in the Hindu tradition to recite mantra. And what you may recognize too in the upper left-hand corner is a rosary, and that's typically used in the Catholic tradition also to recite prayers as you go through the different decades of the rosary. So Buddhism predates Christianity, and Hinduism predates Buddhism, but all these religions borrow from one another. And this tradition of counting prayers with the beads is just one example of how the religions borrow from one another. Okay.
And I'll just mention that we call that syncretism in religion, right? This borrowing. So great.
Syncretism, definitely. Definitely. And more of the syncretism, it can be shown through the cathedral. You'll see this is the cathedral of, I think it's just a depiction of many cathedrals where we have this cross, which is symbolic of Jesus on the cross. And you'll see how similar this design is to the mandala design in Buddhism. And we also have, are also depicted here, is a completed mandala on the left side, and on the right you'll see Buddhists that are creating, or Buddhist monks that are creating a mandala out of colored chalk. And they create this as part of ritual, and after its creation it's destroyed, because this, like all things, is impermanent. So that's why the chalk mandala is destroyed. Okay. So this is a picture of monks and nuns. Upright, or up at the left top, we have some monks. I believe they're Sri Lankan monks, but they could be Thai Buddhist monks. And this is one tradition, the Theravadan tradition. And monks are a very important part of the Buddhist religion. In the right bottom corner, we have nuns who have shaved their heads and are Tibetan Buddhist nuns. And if anything, you can see how happy they are and how satisfying religion is for those who seek it and choose this path. Okay. So we say in Tibetan Buddhism that you need to have both wisdom and compassion to practice this particular philosophy. Wisdom is one wing and compassion is the other. And without both wings, a bird can't fly. So that's kind of the importance of wisdom and compassion. And if you were to go to a Buddhist temple or in the meditation we started with, you would hear how important it is to be wise, to be a wise practitioner, and to be compassionate. So these things are important. We also associate these things with masculine and feminine. Wisdom is the feminine side. Wisdom is represented in some of the meditational deities we have, while compassion is the masculine side. And you can hear that is kind of perhaps being different than what our Western culture is presented to us. In our Western culture, we often see women depicted as nurturer and compassionate and these very, I already said nurturing, but sympathetic kind of virtues, where the man is typically considered wise and strong and the thinking component, but it's seen as exactly the opposite in Tibetan Buddhism. So Tibetan Buddhism all began with Siddhartha Gautama. And around 500 BC, Siddhartha, and that is not the exact date, that's an approximate date. Siddhartha was born, and he was born in a kingdom in the northwestern part of what was then India, but is what is now Nepal. And he was born in a kingdom of the warrior class. And before his birth, his father asked the soothsayers, the wise men at this time, what would his son be like? This was a very common practice to find out about their child, etc. And he was told that his son would be a great religious leader and that he would just be this terrific person that cared about the world and all around him. Well, the king didn't want his son to be a religious leader. He wanted his son to take his place when he died. He wanted his son to inherit his kingdom. So as Siddhartha was growing up, he was given every indulgence, and he was kept closely guarded within the kingdom so that all he saw was beauty, all he knew was pleasure, everything that he could imagine was his. So at the age of 16, he was married to his wife, Yasodhara. And at around age 29, something happened. as he left his home. Typically, as I said, everything was beautiful. He's so perfect and fantastic. At this time when he left his home, he saw four things. One thing that he saw was a wise man, a religious man who was walking around in robes with a begging bowl, etc. The other thing he saw was an old man, and he had never seen an old man before. The third thing that he saw was someone sick, and he had never seen illness before. And the fourth thing he saw was a dead person. So Siddhartha turned to his manservant and asked, "What are these things?" And the manservant explained each one. And it said that at this point, Siddhartha said, I can't let this happen to other beings. People must be happy. People must not suffer. I'll do all I can to make this happen. And so what you can see depicted here is the first step in Siddhartha's renunciation of his royalty, of being a prince. The first thing he did was he cut off his royal topknot that you're seeing there. And then in other depictions that you see later of the Buddha, he has huge earlobes where he's taken out the golden plugs that he wore that symbolized his princedom, his royalty. And also, he's without any of the royal gems that you see here. So after the Buddha decided to renunciate his kingdom, he went on a quest for about 6 years, and he followed all of the teachers of the time that said that their teachings would lead to ultimate enlightenment and the end of suffering. So these things included standing on one foot for countless days and months. It included all kinds of austerities, like sitting out in all types of weather, sitting in the forest, standing, walking, everything. And he accomplished all of the paths that all of the teachers at the time had to offer him. So he was sitting in a forest under a Bodhi tree, and he was practicing eating less than 1 grain of rice each day. And it was at this point where he was very near death that a woman leading her goat herd saw him and offered him milk. And Siddhartha took the milk. And that evening, he had an epiphany, a long, dark night of the soul. And during that time, Maya, which is illusion and ignorance, came to him. Something much like Jesus after 40 days in the desert. And it was at this point that he realized that it was the middle way that led to enlightenment, not the extremes of hedonism and pleasure that he was raised with, and not the extremes of asceticism that he had followed with all of these different teachers, but the middle way. And that night, He touched the earth as his witness, and he became enlightened. And it was after he was enlightened that he spoke to the fellow monks around him, and he gave his very first teaching, which included the middle way and the Four Noble Truths. Next slide. So the Four Noble Truths consist of, there is suffering, desirous attachment. There are causes for our suffering. There's a way out of suffering, and the path that leads us from suffering. So let's begin with the first noble truth. Next slide. There is suffering. And we all know this. Suffering is tanha, and we translate tanha as, can be translated as desirous attachment. And it's our attachment to things that cause our suffering. It's our attachment to wanting things the way we want them. We don't want our loved ones to die. We don't want to suffer, get old and die ourselves. But also, we suffer when slight things happen to us, like when we stub our toe and we hurt and that causes pain. That's one form of suffering. I think I have the four sufferings on the next slide. So we have, excuse me, not four, but three. We have these three categories of suffering, this desirous attachment. There is the suffering of suffering, and that's the suffering when you stub your toe or you twist an ankle. This is the suffering of pain. This is the suffering of being ill. This is the suffering that we know throughout our lives. Then there's the suffering of change. And this suffering is the suffering of old age. This is the suffering of losing those that we love. This is the suffering also of putting your head down for the night, pulling the blanket up to you and feeling so comfortable, only to get hot the next moment and throw the blankets off of you because all of a sudden you're changed. It's too much. So we constantly have this suffering in our life. And the third suffering is a little more subtle, the all-pervasive suffering. And that suffering might be something that you've experienced now as we've been in lockdown and limited in our life. It's that suffering that feels bored with existence. It's that suffering that feels like, oh, I know everything there is to know. It's a very subtle kind of suffering, but its roots might be the anxiety of not being in control, or knowing that life is short, and really not digging into this compassion or caring for others or gratitude, and just, feeling that yourself and what you're going through is more important. So that's kind of the all-pervasive suffering that we all experience at times in our life. Next slide. So this is the wheel of life. And if you ever enter a Buddhist temple, you'll see right at the threshold will be a tanka, or a depiction of a bear, and you can slightly see the bear's teeth at the very top of the slide. And he's holding this wheel of life, samsara. And samsara starts with birth and then death, and I'm trying to find it here, birth and death and getting old and suffering, experiencing illness, and this going around and around. And this is depicted in different ways. You can see a woman birthing in the left-hand corner, and then dying, and then the blind person walking. And these are just representations of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth going round and round. But within this also, you'll see heaven realm, realm of rage and conflict, realm of animals, hell realm, realm of frustrated cravings. That's because in Buddhism, there's a belief that there are 6 realms of existence. The heavenly realm is where there's beauty, pleasure, and ecstasy. Sometimes we see that in the movie stars around us, for example, how they don't seem to have any suffering. They don't seem to age. They're just kind of these beauties that are elevated in our world. Then we have the realm of rage and conflict. This is actually the realm of the demigods. This is not quite heaven. This is perhaps your lesser known celebrities that you see on Dancing with the Stars. These are beings who have a lot of envy and a lot of jealousy because they wish they were stars. They wish they were in that heavenly realm, but instead they're in this medium realm in between states. Then we have the realm of animals. And the realm of animals is the realm of instinct, survival, self-preservation. We also say it's a very fearful realm. So many of you may have pets, dogs or cats or what have you. And this dog or cat is actually, very dependent on you to feed it, to let it out, to give it exercise. It's not in control of its own life. And if we even think of animals out in wilderness, out in safari, out in Africa, perhaps, where I was just in Africa and I went to the lake, and around the lake, they had hippopotami on one side and crocodiles on the other. And there were the zebra, going to, thank God I didn't see anybody killed, or any animal killed, but just that living in fear. You need the water. The crocodiles are like, I can wait all day because you need to get the water. and so, this is the realm of animals. It's the realm of fear. We also believe in Tibetan Buddhism in hell realms. And the hell realms, it says agony, terror, depression. These are the feelings of being in hell, as you know. But, we talk about people going to hell or being in hell. It's a concept in Christianity also, for people that cause the suffering in others, people who kill, people who are cruel. Adolf Hitler is an excellent example of someone that probably went to the hell realm after his life. Who can say? But there are different hells. I think there's like 32 different hells, and much like Dante and his hells, if you're familiar with that. So, there's different hells that correspond to certain deeds. So there's this belief in the hell realm. And then we have this realm of frustrated craving. We call them the hungry ghosts. And some people may have experienced ghosts in their life. They may be surrounded by ghosts. I can't say. We all have our different experiences, but in Buddhism, we call this a realm of neediness, of addictions, compulsions. I mean, we see people with addictions around us all of the time in actual life, but this is a realm too where there are beings that can't get enough. You feed them and they're still hungry. Sometimes we have different rituals around feeding incense to these beings, etc. So it's believed that there's this realm before I get to the last realm, which is the human realm, which I consider myself as saving the best for last. And the human realm is kind of this middle realm. It's not the hell of animal existence or the hell realm or the hungry ghost. And it's not the hedonistic realms of heaven or this realm of rage, this demigods. It's that middle way, that way in between. Because it's only as a human, it's said, that you can attain enlightenment and go on and become a Buddha in your own means, in your own lifetime. So that is samsara, these different realms of existence, and the fact that we go round and round and round.
Well, and I just want to interject quickly because I've kind of, most religions don't have the most concrete version of hell that exists within like Christianity and Catholicism, being this kind of eternal, you're stuck there for all eternity kind of thing. And so this is interesting because it was sort of my understanding that this kind of notion of eternal hell is very Christian, but it's a new thing for me to kind of discover that there's this kind of hell realm that has all these different layers of it. But it's still different because it's generally not something that is everlasting in this kind of, very kind of monotheistic conceptualization. So this is really fascinating, and thanks for sharing that piece.
Yes, yeah, nothing lasts forever. I'm misquoting, I think, Shantideva when I say if something good happens, if something bad happens, it'll end. If something good happens, it'll end too. So nothing is seen as permanent. Impermanence is like one of the tenets of Buddhism.
Awesome.
Thank you. So that was just noble truth number one. The second noble truth is that there are causes for our suffering. So next slide. And we call the causes for our suffering karma. And karma is a popular term. You've probably heard people say, that's karma. Or, what goes around comes around. These are very common terms. And, simplistic but true definitions of karma. Karma is that positive causes lead to positive effects and negative causes lead to negative effects. And you see that constantly in your life. However, another side to this is when we see karma and we're not exactly sure how it's acted out. What I mean by that is, say you have, sorry for the stereotype, but a rich and greedy landlord. And you recognize that this person isn't living with as much compassion and loving kindness as you would hope for. However, you see that, he's driving around in a big car, he has a big house, etc. So you're not seeing this karma played out. However, if there were a God in Buddhism, if there were a higher deity, what we would believe in is karma. So that you may not see harm that happens to another being, but you don't know. He may have been a prince, the kindest person in his former existence. And now he's burning through all that positive karma with his selfishness in this existence. And so maybe his next existence will be a hell. You don't know, but you don't wish it on a being either. You just trust that karma will take care of everything. So that is karma. So I include this poem, and I'd like you just to reflect on it. I'm going to read it aloud, and what I'd like you to do is just think about what it means in your life, or what it would mean to someone you perhaps know. So anger feeds on the food of feeling upset, then strengthened, turns to smash me. And so then I will smash the sustenance that feeds this enemy of mine. My foe knows no other kind of work at all except to cause me pain. No matter what happens, I will never allow my joy to be disturbed. Feeling upset cannot accomplish my hopes, and only makes me lose the goodness that I have. If there is something you can do about it, why should you feel upset? If there is nothing you can do about it, what use is being upset? And so this was written by Shantideva, the 8th century Indian Buddhist monk who lived in Nalanda in India, and his teachings were translated and brought to Tibet and influenced Tibetan teaching. Also, if you look at this, you can also see how the prayer of Saint Francis, Lord, grant me the wisdom to see, oh my goodness, it's a 12-step prayer too, used by Al-Anon. The wisdom to change what I can change, to accept what I can't, and have the wisdom to know the difference, which I'm terribly paraphrasing here, but look at this poem and see how you can see it taking place in your life. And why should you feel upset? What's the use of being upset? It's just something to think about. Next slide. So the third noble truth, and there is a way out of suffering, and that way is the next slide. There's a state of complete cessation of suffering and its causes, which is nirvana. So nirvana is something, it's a state where it's said that your buttons can't be pushed because you have no buttons, because you've gotten to this point of enlightenment and understanding. Next slide. So this understanding is the fourth noble truth, which is the path that leads us from suffering. And that path is the next slide. It's called the Noble Eightfold Path. And each of these refers to a different concept, a different thought in Buddhism. So right view is an understanding of the Buddhist principles and ideas. It's being free of ignorance and recognizing the interconnectedness of all life, of all beings. Right intention is this motivation to do the right thing, to live in loving kindness, to have compassion for others. Right speech is not gossiping, not saying things that undermine others. It's talking about being truthful, but not truthful to the point of hurt or harm. If I know it makes you feel better if I say how pretty you look today, then saying how pretty you are, seeing that beauty is a truth in itself, even though it may not be completely truthful. So it's really doing no harm with one's speech. Right action is doing the right thing when the right thing is called upon. It's the many choices we make each day about how to live, how to act, how to react, what to do. Right livelihood refers to having a job, a profession, volunteer opportunity, whatever, but to do things that promote human existence, happiness of all beings, our interconnectedness, things that don't cause harm. Some of the things that cause harm, we're told that being a butcher, chopping up life, is one of the less savory livelihoods. Even though, butchers make a lot of money, it's more of this overarching concept that all life has value. And so being a vegetarian would be more ideal than being a meat eater, because you're not then taking a sentient being. Also, being an arms dealer would be a very negative livelihood, because then you are dealing in weaponry that may cause, or by its very nature, causes harm to others. Mm-hmm. So those would be negative livelihoods. Positive livelihoods could be everything else, such as your teacher, Natalie, here. This is a very positive, it's a very positive livelihood, because she's imparting knowledge, she's helping you to awaken and broaden your mind and perhaps have a better life. With this degree, you might be able to go on and pursue careers and dreams and aspirations that you want. And, you might be the person that saves us from the next pandemic or the next apocalypse, which I always thought would be the zombie apocalypse. So now I'm just beginning to question the apocalypse that will come. The right effort is just trying, again, it's very similar to right action. It's doing the right thing, having this right motivation. We say that good intentions pave the road to hell, but in Buddhism, intention, motivation is extremely important. If you're trying to do it for the right reasons, for loving reasons, then it's a good thing. Your efforts count. Right mindfulness, we're familiar with mindfulness. That means meditating. It means focus. And it's very similar to right concentration, which is, really keeping your eyes on the prize, trying to live a life that is within this Noble Eightfold Path. So those are the 8 steps to overcoming suffering, and that lead to enlightenment eventually. So let's talk about the spread of Buddhism. So what you can see here from this map is that Buddhism started in India, but it didn't take hold there. It gained a lot of traction in Tibet, Tibetans actually went back to India and translated all the original texts and writing and came up with their own form of Buddhism, which reflects the Tibetan culture. It also went on to China, and I think in a later slide I talk about how this Buddhism spread to China from the writings of Indian monk. It then goes to Korea, Japan, and it also comes from its beginnings in Bodh Gaya under the Bodhi tree to Sri Lanka, and then from Sri Lanka to Burma, Thailand, Laos. What you see here, though, depicted are the two different forms of Buddhism, Theravadan and Mahayana. And I think I talk about that more in the next slide. So Mahayana Buddhism, well, Theravadan Buddhism believes that there was this one person, the Buddha, Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, and he became the Buddha, and we meditate and pray and do practices to become better people so that eventually we leave the cycle of rebirth and are simply cease to exist. I don't know if Theravadins actually, as I'm saying this, I don't know if Theravadins actually believe that they're joined to something greater than themselves. I'm not certain. And often when the Buddha was asked questions like this, he would say things like, well, you know, what do you need to know now? What can you handle now? What is your understanding? And I'm not as familiar with that Theravadan belief because I come from the Mahayana tradition. And the Mahayana tradition believes that we are all Buddha becoming, that within ourselves, within our womb, we have Tathagata Garbha, this enlightenment that is in all of us. And Garbha actually means womb. So it's this womb of enlightenment that's inside of us. And practices like Buddhism help us to go along this path of enlightenment. So we are striving to become a Buddha. And as Mahayana Buddhists, we have the opportunity to pledge our lives to become bodhisattvas. And a bodhisattva is this being that just lives for the happiness and enlightenment of all sentient beings in life after life after life. So a bodhisattva vows that they'll just keep coming back. They'll keep existing until they can bring all beings to happiness and enlightenment. Everyone can come along. And so the pledge or the prayer of the bodhisattva is as follows: for as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the suffering of all beings. So the bodhisattva or a bodhisattva looks at life and says, well, if life is samsara, and I'm just going around and around and around with this constant birth and life and death and birth again, then I might as well try to have the best life that I possibly can and try to have the best life that I can help others to attain. So that's the reason for this bodhisattva ideal. And that's the basis of Mahayana. Now, mantra is the focus of my dissertation. I did my dissertation, which is titled Invoking the Blessings of the Tibetan Buddhist Goddess Tara through chanting her mantra to overcome fear. So within Tibetan Buddhism, we have these, what we call meditational deities. And the meditational deities represent qualities or aspirations that we want for ourselves in our own life. My particular connection to my aspirational deity, Tara, is that she is someone that helps us overcome fear. And we chant her mantra, Om Tare Tutare Ture Saha. And so we chant that to say, help me to overcome fear, help me to meet success, etc. So in Sanskrit, mantra is very much like prayer. It's a sacred language. Excuse me. It comes in the sacred language of Sanskrit. and it's two things, manas, meaning mind, and trust being tool. So mantras are this tool to protect the mind. And chanting mantra is like a prayer that invokes this yidam, this meditational deity, and invokes just like you would do with any kind of prayer. Where we say the Lord's Prayer, or any type of prayer from any religious tradition that we're in, we're typically praying for, our health, our safety, for our loved ones, for money, for any of our needs to be met. So mantra is very similar to that. And there are many meditational deities in Tibetan Buddhism, very many. The most popular, the most well-known mantra in all of Tibetan Buddhism is Om Mani Padme Hum. And that is the jewel in the lotus. We are actually meditating on compassion and this embodiment of compassion. In Tibetan Buddhism, this embodiment of compassion is a male deity, meditational deity called Chinrezig. In Sanskrit, his name is Avalokiteshvara. And Tibetans believe that he is manifested in His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is actually Chinrezig, this meditational deity that we chant to for compassion and enlightenment. And if we can just take a moment now and again, just kind of settle in, I'd like for us to just chant this mantra together. I'd say let's do it 21 times because it's such a happy tune. And 21 times I think will help put it in your heart and you can feel it in your body. So just assume that position of meditation, sitting up straight, spine erect, being comfortable and confident. And again, just find that compassion and loving kindness in your heart and that desire for all beings to be happy, for all beings not to suffer, for all beings to become enlightened with compassion, seeing our interconnectedness to one another. And now we're going to chant this tune together. And on your own, just join me when you feel comfortable with the tune. Om Mani Padme Hum, 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 Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum, 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 Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. Next slide. So, how mantra and Buddhism relate to this concept of magical realism. Magical realism is a belief in miracles. It's a belief in spontaneous and indescribable phenomena, that fantastic things are possible and real, and that anything can happen. When we believe in deity or energy or a universe or anything that is beyond our control, like life itself, this is kind of believing in magical realism, believing that prayer makes a difference either to energy or the effects of anything around us. This too is magical realism. So that all religion, and even non-religion sometimes, have this concept or have this belief in magical realism, whether they recognize or acknowledge it. So just to conclude, I wanted to show you some of the Buddhist symbols that you see around you, or you may have seen and not been familiar with. There is the lotus, which is very popular, and the lotus is a Buddhist symbol because the lotus blooms from mud and guck and dirt and becomes this very beautiful thing. So no matter what kind of mud, guck, and dirt you've been around in your life, you know, this possibility for this beautiful flower to emerge is possible. Also depicted here is a prayer wheel that Buddhist monks spin around so they can say their mantras, but also there's mantras on the object, so prayers are said to be going out to the world. You see the monks making their sand mandala. You can see this knot, which is an eternal knot and just shows how things go round and around and around and around, and there's no beginning and there's no end. And then the wheel of Dharma, which symbolizes all of the teachings, the 80,000 plus teachings of the Buddha in his lifetime. And this is some of the Buddhist architecture. So you can see Borobudur behind me, and this is Borobudur from the top of the structure. And it is actually a mandala that's in, right there in Indonesia. Also, let's start with the upper left-hand corner and go counterclockwise. We have, again, Borobudur, the image behind me up close, where you can see the Buddha later in the morning. Then we have a giant stupa at Bodh Gaya, where there is the actual, or the ancestor of the actual tree, the Bodhi tree where the Buddha attained enlightenment. It's on the backside of that stupa. And then we see giant Buddhas in Japan, in China, and Thailand, just absolutely beautiful. So that's some of the Buddhist art and architecture within Asia. And here's the lotus, just to remind you all that no matter how stuck you may feel, beauty can come from that. You can be the beauty within the mud and the muck and the mire. So
That's so wonderful. I just want to say thank you so much. This was really great. So yay, if my students were here, yay, we would all be applauding you now. And I really appreciate that. It was very enlightening. And I think it's worth repeating that this is a very, Buddhism is massive in terms of how many different incarnations it is. And just as with Islam and Christianity and Hinduism, there's lots of different ways that it's practiced. And this is specific to Tibetan Buddhism, which I think you had mentioned in the past that it's, has more of this kind of magic and ritual aspect compared to more other ascetic practices. Is that correct?
that is very true. That's very true. Zen is a Mahayana tradition, but many of the Buddhists that you find in the United States are actually more of the Theravadan Buddhists, and that's more where people get into just the straight kind of meditation, and not so much of the ritual. But I always say, when I walked into my first Tibetan Buddhist temple, and I saw the garish colors and heard the bells and the noise and the chanting, I knew I was home. So it is very much, it's very much more ritualistic. But I also come from the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. And that's very much the people that believe in study and learning and classes. And so, even though there's this kind of woo-woo ritual component to it, there's very much this grounding in okay, we're going to learn this, and now we're going to learn this, and this person said this, and this is why this. So.
Absolutely. And I just, the last thing I want to mention is you had talked about the Dalai Lama, for people who are unaware, is an incredibly important figure in Tibet and has become kind of a politicized figure insofar as the China relationship to Tibet. And one of the importances of the Dalai Lama is really that he's this kind of manifestation of a meditational deity. And I think that's really important to kind of reiterate. And some of the conflicts with China and Tibet is based on China's kind of desire to lessen the religious influence of the Dalai Lama. Would that be correct in your assessment too? I mean, we can't get into it too much, but just as a basic.
Yeah, I think that in China they value the mineral rights of
Sure.
the land in Tibet, and so undermining kind of this religious practice was a great way to get in there. But within Tibet, there wasn't the separation of church and state. The Dalai Lama was traditionally the leader of the country, the seat of the government, and the religious leader. And so what the Dalai Lama has done in exile is that he has now done a lot to separate these governmental responsibilities from the religious responsibilities. So he's still very much a religious leader, but now they have their own separate government with its own ruling body that is separate and apart from the Dalai Lama.
Right. And I think your point to the mineral, right? I think that we talk about this a lot in class, but capitalism is always an impact on how religion is treated, particularly in the modern world. So that's a good point to bring that up.
Right, right. And you can see, I think it was 1959 when the Dalai Lama fled. And that is when Chairman Mao and China, the People's Republic of China, was formed. And knowing the history of that, this kind of extreme to the other end, where religion was so prominent in Tibet, and in China there was just this complete suppression of all religion. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the same thing happened in the Soviet countries as well. Where
I was thinking the opiate of the masses. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well,
Well, thanks again so much.
Oh, thank
I really
you.
appreciate that. Go ahead.
No,
Sorry,
religion has been used to suppress people in so many places in the world. If you're a good religious person, you do this, you follow the king, the ruler, the leader, you don't question your position, your fate, your outcome. And so it makes a docile people. So this going to the other extreme of no religion can be understandable in places where religion was actually used to keep a people down.
Sure, absolutely. But it's still just but it ends up being another form of extremism in and of itself too, right? So it's an interesting kind of tension between that. You got to take the middle way.
Got to take the middle way.
All right. Thanks so much. I'm going to pause the recording now.
Thank you.